Somewhere lost in the clouded annals of history, two kids walk alone in the woods. Well, I guess today it's just one. I like walking around the woods. It feels aimless. Like I don't have to know where I'm going in order to allow myself to feel at ease. I don't get to do that a lot out there in the real world. Being in the woods can be terrifying, but also weirdly comforting. Both dangerous and safe. There's a reason that this is where so many stories start, or at least where they're headed. The woods are scary, and they've been so throughout most of human history. They're dark, confusing, and untamed. We instinctively understand the danger they pose to us, especially to kids. We know what happens to kids in the woods. Over the Garden Wall is a 2014 miniseries that follows two brothers, neurotic 14-year-old Walt and delightful 5-year-old Gregory, as they find themselves lost in the woods.
Where are we?
In the woods?
I mean, what are we doing out here?
We're walking home.
Greg, I think we're lost. We should have left a trail or something.
I can leave a trail of candy from my pants.
I've only had Arlo for a day and a half. But if anything happened to him, I would kill everyone in this room and then myself.
The woods, colloquially known as the unknown, continuously reveal themselves to be much more complicating as a setting than you'd think. As the two kids try to make it back home, they encounter all sorts of colorful characters, such as Beatrice, a teenage girl who was cursed and turned into a bluebird, and the woodsman, who warns the children that a dangerous beast wanders the woods and preys on the souls of those lost in the unknown.
These woods are no place for children. Don't you know the beast is afoot here?
The beast? We don't know anything about that. We're just two lost kids trying to get home.
Well, welcome to the unknown, boys. You're more lost than you realize.
It's no wonder it has recently become a bit of a Halloween cult classic, annually luring in fans and newcomers alike, with spooky ambience, charming music, and, above all, delightful characters.
School? Psh, not today.
This is a Greg Stan account. There is literally no better character than Greg. I would die for Greg, in fact.
We're burglars!
No, we're not. We just needed to get out of the rain, and we thought this place was abandoned, so...
So we came here to burgle your turts.
No, it's...
But the show's aesthetic isn't necessarily Halloween-y, at least not exclusively. More than anything, it's autumnal. Neither here nor there, the unknown as a setting can be hard to pin down. It's a place of transition, similarly to how purgatory is a limbo between heaven and hell. Over the Garden Wall sees autumn as a limbo between summer and winter. That's the unknown.
And how the gentle wind beckons through the leaves as autumn colors fall.
Part 1. Into the Unknown. There's something weird about Over the Garden Wall.
You know, it's kind of funny finding a basket of turtles in an abandoned house, huh?
Yeah.
Greg, not that kind of funny.
Huh? Oh.
It's not really evident upon first watch, but there's definitely an underlying sense of unease throughout the show because of this. Over the Garden Wall doesn't really make aesthetic sense.
I've got no sense. No sense at all.
From the moment we start off in the middle of the woods with one kid dressed up as a gnome and the other wearing a teapot on his head, we are in an uncertain time period and place. But the arrival of the woodsman, who's kind of dressed like a pilgrim, helps ground it somewhere in New England in the 17th century.
I know what you are. You're a pilgrim.
What? What, like the guys who eat turkey and cranberry sauce?
No, you're a pilgrim.
A pilgrim?
In fact, this whole first episode kind of gives Legend of Sleepy Hollow vibes, which, I think, perfectly sets the stage for the story. It's the fall, it's spooky, and it's American. However, each new episode subtly challenges what we know so far about this world. They quietly expand the temporal scope of the story in ways that don't necessarily jump out because they're all tied together by the timeless woods in between. Both Pottsfield and Miss Langtry's schoolhouse seem to push us forward 200 years to the late 19th century, after which the tavern takes us back to pilgrim times around the late 1600s. Endicott's mansion is extremely British 1700s, and the Frog River boat seems to push us all the way to the late 19th, maybe even early 20th century. Auntie Whispers and Lorna take us back to the late 17th century, and Greg's dream sequence is straight out of 1920s and 1930s American animation.
Well, that's enough.
So I'm obviously going off of first-hand accounts, and I have a large enough pool since every year I introduce the show to new people, but I repeat that this temporal dissonance is not particularly evident at first glance. In fact, the show is so confident that you won't notice this that it's not afraid to point out anachronisms.
Does this room look different to you?
How so?
It's like French Rococo style. That doesn't really seem in line with Endicott's Georgian sensibilities.
How? What? Who on earth am I talking to right now?
Should I not know that sort of stuff?
Wirt asks for a phone in the second episode, a gentle nod to the twist in episode 9.
I'm looking for a phone.
But even that goes unnoticed amidst a much stronger atmosphere. So this is obviously not a mistake, nor is it just a creative impulse. It's a tool from the creators to further establish the disorienting world that Wirt and Greg find themselves in, lulling you into this false sense of familiarity before the show reveals the much more abstract nature of the unknown. Why are we as an audience so willing to go along with this from the start? Spoiler alert, please go watch the show before going any further. It's excellent and it's less than 2 hours long. It's streaming on HBO Max and Hulu. I think it's worth it. Please go watch it. In the penultimate episode, we learn that Wirt and Greg actually come from a 1980s suburban town. On the night of Halloween, Wirt's impatience and dismissal of his younger brother result in the two of them falling into a freezing lake, where they remain unconscious and on the verge of drowning. Rather than a real place, the unknown is literally lost in the clouded annals of history, a spiritual realm for wayward souls stuck in their own personal limbos. The suspension of disbelief and disregard for the inconsistencies is then key for the twist to work. We need to believe the unknown is its own world in order to be surprised when we learn that Wirt and Greg actually come from our own. It's fantastic, but it doesn't really feel like a fantasy world. It doesn't have enough rules or internal logic. No structure. My rib. Broke my rib. Riding the buzz.
The Calzones betrayed me?
The fantasy elements don't feel normal, but they don't feel out of the ordinary either. They're like superstitions or urban legends. Folk tales, passed around among locals as if they were cautionary tales. So it's a fairy tale. Part 2. Ancestral storytelling. Certain storytelling tropes are as old as time, and the assertion that we are already aware of these narratives can be used as a storytelling tool in and of itself. Even the same Greek myth, for example, can be used for different effects in different contexts, building off of these age-old tales and finding something new to say. Our knowledge of these tropes via literature, art, film, and cultural osmosis are, in a way, used against us, the audience, to deliver a story we've heard before in a new way. So, Over the Garden Wall definitely comes from fairy tales, which are an oral and then written form of storytelling that some historians can trace all the way back to the Bronze Age, maybe even the Upper Paleolithic. Now, defining a fairy tale is hard, but most of us know one when we see one. We know that there will usually be magic, royalty, creatures, forests, quests, deals, trickery, and a moral to wrap it all up. The moral is kind of the key element. Not a message like, be yourself or work hard, but rather a warning. Be careful, the world is dangerous.
Why could you not obey? Children should listen.
There one more way to try and make sense of the world around us. A way to pass on wisdom from one generation to the other in an accessible and effective way. A mere warning probably won't keep the child inside, but fear of the witch or the wolf might. Now, fairy tales in the conventional sense are a specific type of Indo-European folk tale, but as we mentioned earlier, Over the Garden Wall is distinctly not European. Aesthetically, Over the Garden Wall uses almost exclusively haunting renditions of traditional Americana, using folk imagery to create a wholly American fairy tale. The last episode before the twist is revealed, the one where Greg realizes he's losing word to the Beast, delivers him this revelation through an homage to early cartoons, arguably the American inheritors of the fairy tale tradition. This is yet another instance of aesthetic disparity, but one that doesn't necessarily stand out because the fairy tale adaptations we are most familiar with are American. Wilhelm Grimm, of the Brothers Grimm, believed that European fairy tales derived from the cultural history shared by all Indo-European people, and were therefore a lot more ancient than commonly thought, far older than even the written word. Take, for example, Cinderella. We are most familiar with two literary versions, Charles Perrault's Cendrillon from 1697 and the Brothers Grimm Ashton Puttel from 1812. They both follow a similar general story. A poor girl tormented by her stepfamily sneaks out to a ball where she meets a prince. As she rushes out of the ball, she leaves behind a shoe, which the prince then uses to find her and ask her to marry him. Perrault's, however, wasn't the first iteration. An Italian version, Cenerentola by Giambattista Basile, was published 60 years prior, but this was only the first European version written in prose. Oral versions can be traced all the way back to the early Roman Empire, when stories were told of Rhodopis, a Greek slave girl in Egypt whose sandal was snatched by an eagle and dropped on the lap of the king, who asked that the owner was found so he could marry her. There's a Turkish version, a medieval French version, a Maltese version, and this is just within Europe. Yexian, a Chinese folktale, tells of a maiden who was given a dress and shoes by magical fish bones so she could attend the festival. This also happens in Tam and Cam, a Vietnamese variation where the maiden is later repeatedly killed and reincarnated. Indonesian, Japanese, and Nigerian iterations also exist, and we can't forget the ones in the Arabian Nights. These all predate the written versions and, despite the regionalisms, their broad strokes tend to remain the same. There are even regional differences between the two most famous versions. French Cendrillon is helped by a fairy godmother who gives her a carriage made out of a pumpkin, a ball gown, and glass slippers. German Aschenputtel, on the other hand, is given her gown and gold slippers by the magical wishing tree planted on her mother's grave. These details trickle down to famous adaptations to this day. There are two major theories that explain the common ground shared by so many fairy tales and folk tales from around the world. Either there is a single point of origin that gave birth to any given story, later spreading across the continents, or these stories are born out of universal human experiences. Either way, they date back thousands of years, permeating our cultures century upon century. We end up with stories that don't even feel timeless, but primal, instinctive, innate. Most of the aesthetics in Over the Garden Wall are quintessentially American, and when they're not, they are purposefully odd and jarring. But the cursed bluebirds, creepy witches, arbitrary deals, and warnings of a mysterious beast immediately and universally cemented the show's fairy tale status. It makes it feel familiar. And so, like so many fairy tales before it, this one starts with two kids lost in the woods. From the very first moment, those storytelling instincts take hold of us, the audience, and evoke the intended targets of fairy tales. Our primal attachment to fear and hope. Mismatched art styles, anachronistic settings, and crazy characters all make the unknown feel foreign, yet also slightly familiar. That's what's so intriguing about it throughout its first 8 episodes. That's what lulls me in. The mere image of two kids lost in the woods trying to make it home is enough to sow a tinge of fear. We know, after all, what happens to children in the woods. But every October, as I try to make it through the last few months of the year and to that imaginary deadline at its end, I revisit Over the Garden Wall, and it's not the woods that unnerve me, nor is it the beast. I am exhausted, and the playful limbo of the unknown isn't really that unsettling. It's comforting, inviting, a fun little harvest festival, a cozy tavern, some potatoes and molasses. I enjoy the hour and a half that I get to spend there, especially because I see myself in a lot of those who are wandering the woods. I've been Beatrice, bitter at everyone around me. I've been Wirt, reciting my own poetry to myself while dramatically admitting defeat. I've been Greg, finding solace in being silly. And I've definitely been Miss Langtree.
I will not stand for such nonsense in my classroom. I got enough nonsense from that no-good, two-timing, low-down, handsome man of mine.
You kind of start to understand how the beast lures you into becoming a part of the unknown. There's comfort in being hopeless. I find that this fear of the woods only becomes more real when it goes beyond the haunting forest imagery and the creepy encounters, when it reaches into our world and invites us to take yet another step into the unknown. Most people don't get lost in the woods nowadays, but a lot of them will have gone through this bitter crush that Wirt is working through. They'll have had to put up with their annoying little stepbrother. They'll feel socially awkward at parties and insecure about the Halloween costume they put together at the last minute. This is where it becomes scary, because it poses the menace of the unknown, not just as a place beyond death, but as a state of hopelessness we are all too prone to. I know I certainly am when every year comes to an end and I am once again faced with the reality that I am not where I'd like to be in life, that holding on to my aspirations feels a little bit harder each time around, and that sometimes getting out of bed feels like the hardest thing in the world. Do you like my costume? I made it myself.
Keep it together, Taylor.
I see Greg being given the task of properly naming his frog, and I laugh at all the silly names he cycles through, and I realize Greg does that to power through the desolation. In fact, he needs to, or else Wirt just wouldn't make it. So as Wirt lets the desolation win and Greg sacrifices himself to save him, the two brothers will have to face the fear that got them there in the first place and what they'll need to get out. A desperate, existential, almost primal attachment to hope. Wirt needs Greg desperately. The beast isn't really out there, but in here, in every one of us. Every character in this purgatory known as the unknown is fighting fear in their own way. Wirt embraces it, Greg fights it, Beatrice has given up to it, the woodsman is struggling not to. So the fear stems ultimately from that hopelessness. What if that dread takes over our lives? What if we feel at ease there? What if we get too used to it?
Take on the task of lantern bearer, or watch your brother perish. Come here.
Okay.
We can't. We shouldn't. So should I try to be a Greg? Can I? Probably not. Again, fairy tales are as much about fear as they are about hope. That's the balance of Wirt and Greg. Greg has enough hope to face the beast, but it's Wirt whose fear and cynicism keep Greg from being too trusting and naive, to keep him grounded. So it's not so bad to be a Wirt.
I'm sorry. Maybe I can fix it? I can't fix it.
It's quite understandable, actually. Just as long, of course, as we don't let the beast win. As long as we remember to bring Greg along. And that's when I remember that fairy tales are more than just a lesson wrapped in a story. They're, well, stories of their own. They'll come with a moral, sure, but that moral is transformed the moment we receive it. We make it our own.
Careful before you say, listen to me. Children will listen.
And thus, just as all those ancestral storytelling traditions helped those two kids make it through the unknown and back home, every October, Over the Garden Wall becomes one more creepily hopeful fairy tale to help us, or at least me, make some sense of this unknown.